Emily is going to have a Menti poll that allows people to give questions throughout and to engage with us. In addition, we'll provide contact information for ourselves and the panel members, and would be happy to talk. We've got a bit of a limited time here today. I guess quickly by way of introduction, my name is Will Peterson. I work for AECOM, and I'm the Utah Municipal Lead based here in Salt Lake, currently focused on delivering a wastewater and water treatment project here in Salt Lake, and trying to work with community stakeholders and focusing on the long-term costs and benefits of the project, really trying to think of that bigger picture view and incorporating green and gray aspects into the projects where possible. Emily, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Will. My name is Emily Corwin. I'm a water resources engineer and the director of nature-based engineering solutions at Conservation International. And as a part of my work at Conservation International, I lead our green-gray infrastructure program, which I'll talk about more now. And as Will mentioned, we're going to use Mentimeter to try and capture some of your comments, your questions, find out more about who you all are and where you're coming from. And also use that platform to give you a chance to answer some of the questions we're going to be asking our panelists today. So if you click on that link there that I pasted in the chat, you should see a screen that looks like this. And the first question is, where are you in the world? And then the second question is a little bit about how you would describe your profession. So feel free to navigate through that and fill in your responses, questions, comments. I'm going to start us off with just a brief introduction to what is green-gray infrastructure, so that we kind of all have in our minds the same thing throughout today's session. So this is a photo from Guyana in South America, which is a good visual of what green-gray infrastructure is. So in this case, it's restored mangroves that are located in front of a strengthened seawall. And the mangroves and the seawall, are working together. They're complementing each other to reduce the exposure and risk of climate threats like sea level rise and storm surge to communities living along the coast. So there are a range of potential solutions that we can use to address the challenge of adapting to a changing climate. In our most built environments, a gray-only solution like seawalls may be most appropriate. And on the other end of the spectrum, a purely green solution like mangrove restoration may be best. So green-gray infrastructure is a type of ecosystem-based adaptation that's drawing upon the best of our engineering achievements to create hybrid solutions along this spectrum. And this map shows Conservation International's green-gray project portfolio, where we're working to innovate and implement green-gray solutions in the communities where we work. And almost exactly 1 year ago, we launched a global green-gray community of practice to amplify our work and, importantly, join with colleagues from around the world who share our mission and vision to fundamentally transform engineering and construction practices to design and build with nature. And I'm really excited to have with us today members of the community of practice to share some of their perspectives during our panel sessions from AECOM, Caterpillar, and Deltaris. So our community has grown to include over 100 member organizations like the ones I just mentioned, and over 300 individual participants. And these are representatives from private engineering and construction companies in yellow, economists, financiers, and insurance experts in green, other nonprofit organizations or civil society organizations in blue, academics in orange, and funders and public agencies in red. So we also aspire to be a community of action. And in January of this year, we released our very first product, which is a practical guide to implementing green-gray infrastructure. And it really was crowdsourced. We solicited inputs and contributions from everyone within the community. So one of the things that gives me hope about the future, which is something we've all sorely needed over the last year plus, is the vision that we have for green-gray and all the various ways that green-gray projects can integrate across a landscape as a climate adaptation strategy and add value to planned and necessary future infrastructure projects. So our goal is to integrate nature into some percentage of the trillions of dollars that will be spent on infrastructure development in the next 20 years. So what's stopping us from achieving this vision? So today's EbA Knowledge Day is about overcoming barriers. And these are some of the barriers that we've identified through the community of practice to reaching scale with green-gray solutions. So these include a lack of dedicated funding and financing for green-gray solutions, a lack of obligation. Currently, projects aren't required to be green-gray, or clients aren't demanding green-gray alternatives to their infrastructure solutions. There's a disproportionate or unequitable global access to technical expertise to implement these projects. There's also few accepted engineering guidelines, which decreases confidence in outcomes. And there's a lack of communicated proof to scale and a lack of the recognition of long-term benefits. So just quickly, I'll mention a couple of things that we're doing at Conservation International and with the community of practice to overcome these barriers. And really, what I want to focus on is the need to build new markets for ecosystem-based adaptation solutions like green-gray infrastructure. So we're working to validate and design a dedicated green-gray funding and financing mechanism. We're developing a tool for economic evaluations of green-gray projects that will allow project planners and designers to compare between green infrastructure, green-gray alternatives, and gray alternatives. And we're soliciting commitments from within our community to fund, design, and build green-gray projects. So we'd love to have you join us. We'll paste some links into the chat to information about the green-gray community. And now I'm going to pass it back to Will, who's going to share a little bit more about some of the project work that AECOM's been working on with green-gray infrastructure.
Great, thanks, Emily. Appreciate that overview. I feel like it painted a really good picture of green-gray infrastructure. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, talk through a few representative projects. So we're going to start looking at kind of more of a regional perspective. So these are some larger scale projects that are incorporating nature-based solutions in green-gray infrastructure. So won't go into too much depth on all of them, but starting on the left, AECOM worked on a coastal resilience master plan for the Texas coastline. You can see there that it covered 400 miles of coast and 3,300 miles of bays and estuaries. And it's certainly not unique to do a master plan of this scale, but I think what was interesting about this project is that as the team looked to enhance coastal resilience, there's a really strong emphasis on how to utilize natural infrastructure, which really can be served as a model for other coastlines and other applications. The two on the right both focus on the Mississippi River in Louisiana. The Mid-Barataria sediment diversion, I think, is a really fascinating project. The lower Mississippi Delta is facing a significant reduction in natural sediment that's primarily driven by coastal development. And since the early 1900s, it's estimated they've lost 295,000 acres of land, which is kind of an astounding amount of land loss. So this project is looking to reconnect the Mississippi River, and with that, the natural sediments that come with it, to those areas that are facing land loss. And so that land or the sediments that'll be provided are going to be used to build new land, to restore wetlands and marshes, and also establish habitat. I think we can go to the next slide. These next few look at a bit more focused application. So we've got three here. The one on the left is a shoreline restoration in Florida. So this was a previously undeveloped area along Florida's Indian River that was experiencing severe shoreline erosion problems driven by large storms and development outside the area that was impacting this. So the team implemented natural shoreline techniques using ecological restoration. And then the two on the right, both in Brooklyn, New York, And I think these are both interesting because it's looking at areas that are urbanized and finding ways to incorporate natural solutions. And with that, you can see there's the accomplishment of the project objectives, but also these improved public access, these recreational areas, really that benefit the community and broader stakeholders. If you go to the next slide, so this looks at one of the things, and Emily touched on the green-gray guide that the community of practice put together. Within that, there's a really extensive list of case studies. We felt like looking at case studies of different applications in different geographies give a really good guidance for areas that are exploring green-gray to see how to apply these, and this kind of gives a snapshot of different geographies, different applications. And you can see throughout these, there are carbon sequestration benefits, restoration, resilience, promotion of biodiversity, a really exciting range of benefits that came from these projects. And this is kind of a brief snapshot, but would welcome anyone to look at that green-gray guide to get into a bit more depth. Emily, I'll hand it back over to you. And just if you're still on mute, just so you know.
Perfect. Oh. Thank you. All right, awesome. Thanks, Will. That was yeah, great to see those examples. So hopefully, if you're just joining us, we're using Mentimeter to capture kind of some questions and comments throughout the session today. I'm going to paste the link in the chat again here. But just quickly to see, let's see where folks are from. Somebody's from a really long number. That's cool. Too bad it's not pi. Looks like we've got great representation from Philippines, Germany, the Netherlands, Ecuador, Vietnam, DC. Thanks so much for joining us. And awesome. Researcher and nature protector are the biggest kind of representative professions here. So yeah, please navigate if you can to that Mentimeter link, and we'll transition into the panel. And as we ask our panelists the different questions, feel free to share your answers to the same questions, because we want to hear your responses as well. So with that, I'll stop sharing and pass it back to Will.
Awesome. Well, I guess before we jump into the questions, let's introduce the panel. So Justin Van Dever is a coworker of mine at AECOM. He's based in California, where he's a registered PE focused on coastal and marine science, engineering, water resources, climate change adaptation. Thanks for joining, Justin. Then we have Brege van Westenbeck with Deltaris, joining us from the Netherlands. With Deltaris, she applies nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction and climate change. In addition, Brege is an associate professor at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. Thanks for joining, Brege. And then last but not least, Don McNeil with Caterpillar. Don is the Strategic Growth Manager and Director of Natural Infrastructure Initiatives at Caterpillar. Thanks, Don. So first question for the panel, and maybe Don, if you wouldn't mind starting, how can we overcome barriers to implement green-gray solutions in using your sector as kind of when you talk through this?
Yeah, so I guess I'll approach it a lot from the natural infrastructure initiative side, more than the Caterpillar side, because obviously our customers and our partners are doing a lot of the work and implementation. But as we've looked at barriers, we really have keyed in on a few different key factors, because we collectively think about ourselves as the group as a torque converter for the space. So we look at awareness, the tools that are supporting the industry growth, and then policy. And really, I think in a lot of cases, in a lot of parts of the U.S. as well as the world, we're still at the beginning. So really want to focus on awareness, and I kind of think about it in a few different ways. If you look at a potential sponsor of a project, do they already have a view and understanding of their options? Do they approach engineering firms to say, hey, build me a piece of concrete and rebar, or do they look at, or do they get back different options? As an example I use frequently is if I live in the Midwest of the U.S., so I'm pretty far away from any of the major coasts, but You know, if you're a mayor or a city council person and you just experience an impact, you know, from flooding or other related events, you know, what are your first phone calls? Do you call a civil engineering firm that gives you a built infrastructure solution? Do you make a second phone call to maybe a different firm that provides, you know, more of a hybrid solution or a natural infrastructure solution? And I think, you know, as you think about that, there's the awareness of an option, but also the visibility of what completed projects look like from a reference standpoint. You know, really at that point in time is when you can start to look at the other barriers, I think, of, you know, what are accepted tools, some of the science, and really understand how money can be made in the space from a private sector standpoint, or from a public, how you can save money. You know, with this whole space, though, you know, if you get past the awareness and then you're into consideration and evaluation, I really think that green, gray, natural infrastructure, hybrid, whatever you want to call it, it's that issue that can bring all the fronts together. It can be both fiscally and environmentally responsible. And at the same token, you know, this is the big and. You know, this isn't natural infrastructure or, you know, built infrastructure. It's the and. You know, can you do both, or can they work simultaneously? So that's a couple different views of, I guess, from that perspective. Hopefully that that helps.
That's a great answer. It's a good point of making sure folks know the options and then also have case studies or examples that they can look at to see how it's implemented. Breakout, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, thank you, Will. Yeah, I wanted to refer to them EcoShape enablers, and they listed barriers and they transferred them to enablers. And there are 6, but I picked out the 4 that I find most relevant for this discussion. Probably the first one is technological and system knowledge, and I think one of the barriers is, of course, because each sector has its own barrier in implementing, right? So there's not one single answer to it. But I think one of the things that we see happening is that implementation of green and gray solutions, and especially for the green or nature-based solutions, you require a lot of more knowledge of your natural system. And in many countries, we have a complete lack of data of natural systems or of deltas or of river systems or coastal systems and their dynamics. So I would actually say, without data, do not start implementing solutions or interventions. And we do that a lot in the world, but it often goes the wrong and unexpected ways, actually. Then master planning is a key element here as well. So setting objectives. What do you want to achieve in this region? What are your targets you're actually designing for? That will actually help to define clearer interventions and what's your objective with the interventions. And then if you do this, what you also need is an adaptive management, monitoring, and maintenance plan. So we often implement solutions, but we don't monitor, we don't manage, and we all run away. And this goes for both green and gray solutions. And if you're planning not to follow up, there's no point in implementing. Then don't do anything, invest in something else. So always follow up, monitor, see if you achieve your target that you've set before. And if you don't achieve it, then act on it and try to adapt so that you achieve your target, or actually think of alternative solutions. And that's your responsibility to people that live in the area, to communities that you design interventions for. And then coming to that community, the key element is stakeholder inclusion, of course. Top down, of course, because you need to have national government or regional government support, but also bottom up. Many interventions in the world have no bottom up involvement of communities. So I see levees, dikes across the world there that are adapted during construction to allow fishermen to still drag their boat to the coast. And then basically the design conditions are already thrown overboard. So I mean, including these local people and asking them what they actually think would be a good solution, and at least mapping the stakeholder landscape and looking at their needs, looking at their relation to the ecosystem, how they use it for their livelihoods, is very relevant. And then a last one, and the most complex one, I think that I would like to mention, is institutional embedding. So nature-based, it already says it's green and gray. So there won't be a single department or ministry that's responsible for it. So you need to find where is the institutional embedding of this solution. Do these ministries or departments need to talk together, and how do we link between them?
So making sure that that dialogue is happening between those different partners.
Yeah, and that's very difficult, of course.
Yeah, thank you. And then Justin, over to you.
Great, good responses so far. Yeah, so I just wanted to provide a perspective sort of from a consulting engineer point of view for coastal and estuarine environments. The first barrier I wanted to kind of highlight is like the engineering profession has a sort of perception that failure is not acceptable, which is kind of a paradigm that engineers typically work under. So having uncertainty in the performance of a project is something that gives a lot of licensed engineers quite a bit of heartburn. So, whether it's from a professional liability standpoint, or simply the standpoint that a consultant is traditionally hired to develop a solution that has a high likelihood of success, venturing into that kind of less certain design space can be challenging. So I think we need to give more latitude to these projects, not necessarily to be like open to failure, but to recognize that as we learn more about how to design and construct these types of projects, the metrics by which they're evaluated need to have more flexibility in how they're judged, because their performance is a lot less certain and it's dependent on a number of environmental factors that may be outside the control of the project. And the other point I wanted to highlight was sort of this perhaps misplaced focus on what I call like aesthetic green infrastructure. And by that, I mean these like nature-based features that provide kind of the appearance of greening the shoreline or so forth. They kind of make us feel good about what we're doing, but they don't really advance the needle in terms of restoring actual functionality of systems. So that's not to say that there isn't value in implementing those types of smaller scale projects, because I think there's a lot still to learn from them. And there's a public education component, which is really important. They're visible. But I think to realize the full value of green-gray projects, we need to look for opportunities to be more transformative in the modifications that we're making to our existing infrastructure and shorelines, and not just try and dress them up with green features, but to actually provide more physical and ecosystem functionality.
It's a great point, that focus on functionality and outcomes. Yeah. Emily, do you want to?
Yeah, those answers were really fantastic. Thank you, guys. I feel like we could have write a whole paper on what the things you mentioned. So the next question, and I think we have maybe a minute from each of you to respond to this. So sorry, it's not much time, but we talk about overcoming barriers often with incentives. So I'm curious, like if you could just, any ideas you have for incentives you've seen done for other sectors, or incentives specifically for green gray that we might want to consider. Don, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I guess I almost start before incentives in equal consideration. So I'm not sure how much value there is in the incentive space until you overcome that roadblock. Sometimes obviously incentives can lead to, efforts that aren't sustainable. If they're taken away, then, things can stop. And that's, consideration in cost benefit ratios, evaluating long-term aspects of projects as opposed to short-term, and other potential mutual benefits that come from it. So I think that really, though, the main incentive, if you will, for me is, from a sponsor or a contractor that might be doing the work, it comes down to, can it be easier to execute the project when planning, permitting, community engagement, and all those things, and provide an equal or more attractive financial benefit for both the sponsor and that. The public sector has a role here, but I think the really growth driver in the future is going to come from the private side. And if it's a disadvantage, it's not going to be considered the same. So I think really that incentive is how easy, financially attractive it is. So it's a little bit different than your question, but I think that's really the sustainable way for this space to really grow is in that space.
Perfect. Thanks, Don. And Brehe?
Yeah, good points. I can build on it. For me, it would be actually first stop adverse incentives. I think that would already pay off enormously. But building on your cost benefit, I was thinking it would enormously help if we start accounting for the real costs of projects, and not only for the economic cost or return of investment of a single solution. But if we actually would use our economic and instruments and our cost benefit analysis and evaluate multiple alternatives and evaluate the real benefits, which means not only economic benefits, but also other benefits. And like Justin made this very good point about natural value of projects. And if we also start accounting for natural value for carbon emissions of projects, then adding to this the benefits and the longer term perspective. So don't evaluate your project on a 10-year, on a 20-year, but look longer and use a principle of what is this new book, Good Ancestorship, right? I mean, the project cannot revert any sort of burden to other generations.
Great, thank you. And Justin?
Yeah, that's a good point. It reminds me that, operations and maintenance costs and monitoring costs are often not included in the alternatives evaluation stage. So when I was thinking about incentives, I was sort of thinking about it from like a permitting and regulatory side of things, which I'm not a permitting expert, but that's like exactly the point. Like it's this very daunting thing when you're sort of thinking about like what's possible. And a lot of these types of projects were talking about not necessarily like creating new habitat, but rather changing the mix of habitat or providing space for marsh to say migrate upslope in the future in response to sea level rise. And it kind of gets in this tricky permitting and mitigation space because we don't know exactly how to deal with those types of situations. And I think that that's changing. So there's a lot of progress on that front, but I think there's sort of this perception that permitting agencies are kind of constrained by their regulations, and so we, don't know exactly how to approach those types of projects. So I think some sort of incentive to be able to offer mitigation credits where you have these sort of non-traditional projects where future habitats may be being facilitated but not created today. Could potentially be valuable to kind of helping progress some of these efforts.
Great, thank you so much. I wish we had more time. I know we will within the Green Gray Community of Practice and other collaborative spaces to dig into these in more detail. And unfortunately, due to time, I don't think we'll have time to take questions from the audience, but I do quickly want to see what some of you shared as your answer to these questions. So in how can we overcome barriers to implementing Green Gray solutions, better science communication to influence policy and stakeholders, knowledge and information, promote positive effects of successful projects, and we need to have long-term commitments are a couple of the answers here. And then for the question, what incentives could be used to realize more Green Gray projects? Subsidies, tax incentives from government, lesser logistics for permitting such projects, aesthetics, and can function as mitigation measures. Great, thanks so much. And if we had more time, we would have asked a question maybe on, ooh, this is a good one. How do you convince a traditional politician to implement such projects? So a teaser for next time. Thank you all so much, especially to our panelists for joining us on this EbA Knowledge Day, number 7, and maybe we'll pick it back up on number 8 and have made some strides. But in the meantime, all of you, I know you're on the ecosystem-based adaptation journey with us, and would happily welcome you into the Green Gray community as well. So, well, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Nope, that was perfect. Thank you. Yeah, really appreciate the panelists. That was a great discussion. Wish it could go longer, but like you said, we'll do it next time.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
All right. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Will. Thanks, Emily.
Take care.